Here's today's video on Salesforce anti-patterns inspired by the book authored by Lars Malmqvist, a Salesforce CTA and a recognized authority on the subject. What you're about to watch is a recording from bi-weekly Salesforce architecture class I used to teach, where we broke down real-world challenges, why they happen, and how to design cleaner, more scalable solutions. These lessons are just as relevant today, especially if you're building enterprise orgs or working toward the CTA credential. I also want to say a huge thank you to everyone who's been supporting the LucidCTA channel. I truly appreciate it, and I hope you're kicking off the new year strong. There's a lot of fresh content coming up, including CTA mock review sessions and deeper architecture dives. Please be sure to watch, like, and subscribe, and don't forget to click on the bell so you'll get the immediate notifications when the new content is out. Once again, thank you for being a part of a LucidCTA audience throughout 2025 as we wrapped up our first full year on YouTube. And here's to an exciting and successful 2026. Happy New Year. And as always, I will see you on the other side of your comfort zone.
I think this is a topic that is near and dear, in quotation marks, to just about anybody working in software development and all kinds of projects, especially when it comes to Salesforce. And what are anti-patterns? So strategies that may seem to solve a problem in the short term that can cause additional problems in the long term, right? And what is a pattern exactly? So this is something that is a repeatable approach, a repeatable practice, or something that you do over and over. And in this case, a pattern is not a good thing. So anti-patterns are essentially, this is a whole presentation on things not to do. And I understand that not all of us may be in a complete control. Nobody's ever in complete control of a big project, but you may not even be able to influence the project in a big way, but just being aware of what the anti-patterns can be and their impact, the potential impact on the project. You may be empowered to do something about this, to raise this as a risk, to communicate that to your project manager, the PMO, or the Scrum Master, basically anybody who has a greater degree of influence, and abstain from those anti-patterns, so thus highly increasing the probability of success of the projects. So this presentation came to mind and I was reading a very nice article by Lars Malmqvist in Salesforce Ben. I thought this was a very nice overview of just a few anti-patterns. And then I discovered that there was a book that he wrote. So this is the book that kind of inspired me. I went through this book and I didn't read everything just yet, but I will be absolutely going through this with a finer level of detail. And so I did borrow some of these concepts, but then I did my own independent research, so I'm not plagiarizing this book at all. However, I do highly recommend this book, available on Amazon. It's just called Salesforce Anti-Patterns, and there's a link to it at the end of this presentation. So not very large, and it reads really well. It's not dried at all. It's basically, he goes over the various stories, and these are stories probably gleaned from his experience, but these are stories with fictional characters. Anyways, on to the anti-patterns. So why should we care, right? So first of all, we don't want to not be successful in our projects, but what exactly makes them unsuccessful? So anti-patterns are not only near-term, have near-term implications, but long-term implications as things become much more expensive to fix down the road. So we get reduced efficiency, increased costs, poor user experience, data quality issues, security risks, reduced scalability, and upgrade challenges. So these are diametrically opposed factors to what Salesforce has been designed to do. The efficiency that Salesforce can offer can be greatly increased. That's one of the key selling points of Salesforce, right? So there's plenty out of the box that works really, really well. So there's no need to take a roundabout approach. So basically you want to use the standard objects and automations the way they were meant to be used. And we'll talk about that a bit more. Increased cost. So Salesforce is fairly expensive to begin with, especially the implementations are expensive. So with anti-patterns, the costs can just skyrocket. And so that would be ethically a wrong thing to do, to increase these costs artificially just because it seems to solve the problem now. User adoption can be really good, really fantastic. It could be really successful if Salesforce implementation is designed well and if it's intuitive. And so if you create something which allows for poor user experience, well, no matter if it works or it doesn't work, the users aren't going to take advantage of it. And therefore, that's going to be a point of failure. So definitely try to put yourself in the shoes of the user. You don't want to frustrate them because they don't want to be frustrated yourself. And data quality issues, that's a really, really big one. So data quality is paramount, it's super important. And why do you use data? What do you use it for? Primarily to make decisions that affect the business. So therefore, data has to be as clean, as accurate as possible in order for Salesforce to be worth its salt. Not even mentioning the other systems that Salesforce can and does integrate with. Security risks, so that's definitely a big one. Security is one of the cornerstones of Salesforce. It's designed to be a secure system, but no system is fully secure, especially if corners are cut and shortcuts are made. So security risks are something that you may not even realize at the moment, but this is definitely going to come back and bite everybody later. Salesforce is meant to be a very scalable system. So if you cut corners, then scalability can be reduced. And that also kind of defeats the purpose of software as a service type system, of which Salesforce is arguably the most successful implementation in the world. And then, of course, upgrade challenges. So Salesforce, as you know, is upgraded 3 times a year. And if you have a lot of custom build in there, then these upgrades aren't going to be, in some cases, even possible. However, the upgrades eventually are forced upon you, and you have no choice but to implement those upgrades or adjust your system to work with those upgrades. So if there's something that was built in a kind of a not following the best practices, or if it's a huge departure from best practices, then the upgrades will conflict with what was actually built within the system. And so the upgrades will become challenges rather than solutions to some longstanding issues that Salesforce is now responding to. Not to mention new functionality, which Salesforce puts out with nearly every release. So this is why, in short, we should care about anti-patterns and care in a way that we want to avoid anti-patterns. Okay, so consequences, and these are some examples. So over-customization is definitely a big one. It's probably a number one. Why does the over-customization happen? Well, because somebody thinks, well, the more we over-customize Salesforce, the better it is, because then we're just showing that we are, as developers, as functional developers, as a team that implements Salesforce, we are so good that we're going to one-up Salesforce. We'll build feature that it doesn't have, and we'll over-customize it for the client, whether or not the client wants it, to prove our value, right? And so it ends up being bad most of the time. Or if the customer decides to not really quite understand what Salesforce is meant to do, and then asks for these unnecessary upgrades, and you just say yes to everything. So you end up with things like too many Apex triggers, too many custom objects that already are supposed to be doing the same thing as standard objects and the functionality. There's no need for that. Complicated visual force pages. So visual force is kind of going goodbye at this point. Not yet completely, but Lightning Web Components are basically taking over. So you definitely don't want to be stuck with visual force pages, because there's security risks and all kinds of scalability risks that we already spoke about. And unnecessary code, that's another thing. If all you know is how to code, then the code is a solution to everything, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And unnecessary code is just that, it's unnecessary. So Salesforce, remember, is a low-code, no-code type of platform. So a code is to be used when nothing else will solve the problem. So this is a measure of last resort. So if you cannot solve the issue with functional development, if there's no managed package that exists or can be afforded by the client or by the budget, then yes, you can write the code, but try to minimize that. Also, changing the interface. When a client buys Salesforce, as you know, they have to accept it for what it is. If they don't like the interface, well, perhaps they could try a different system. So the interface can be changed to a point. A lot of managed packages come with their own type of interface, but they are not to conflict with what Salesforce has designed. And ultimately, Salesforce is not a website, right? It's software as a service. It is consumed via the browser. However, it is not to be confused with a website that can be shaped in any way you like. So the custom interface in this case is just not necessary. And there's plenty of opportunities to work within the framework of Salesforce and not depart from best practices to give the kind of user experience that the client will desire. I would say overwhelming majority of the clients would be okay with that. So now we're getting to some of the very common Salesforce anti-patterns. So there's main 6 so that I borrowed from Lars. Hero, God object, spaghetti code, golden hammer, cargo cult, programming, and design by committee. So I'm not going to reread this here. This is just short snippets, but I will go in a bit more detail about each one of these. So this is probably the most common one, and almost everyone who has worked in Salesforce for a while as a consultant or an administrator can relate to this one. So when you're trying to do everything you possibly can to make the project a success, to please your boss, your client, your team, you're fully committed, and you become that hero. And so that's both good and bad. First of all, you could solve the problem, right? But there's only so much you can do on your own in isolation. So you end up as the only person who knows how everything works. There's no time to write documentation. And if you decide to leave the company or your organization or the client, or God forbid something happens that you're no longer able to work, then that knowledge goes away with you. And so then they cannot continue because they don't know how things were built. So they have to reverse engineer everything. So then the team becomes too over-reliant on that person. And therefore, the user adoption suffers because they're just afraid to touch things. They're afraid to make progress, and they become extremely conservative. So over-reliance is bad in this case. Now, imagine the hero is always needed. It's always required, right? So the burnout potential is extremely high. What if that person needs to take a vacation? That actually happened to me before. And that person is so needed that they are being contacted on vacation, and then they just say, well, I better step away from all this. So then you end up with what we just discussed, knowledge silo. You walk away from the project, and you no longer want to be the hero because you're burnt out. And team growth. So It's how many times have you said to yourself, well, I should train others on how to do this or that, but there's no time to do that. It would be better if I just did it myself. It would be quicker. So let me just do it and I will explain this later. And that never happens. So the team never really grows and the hero ends up basically containing all of that knowledge. And so that is actually that inhibits the successful development of the not just the project but the whole company itself. So the way to mitigate this is to really foster collaborative team environments. So if somebody does end up surfacing as that hero, as that person who is like a natural leader, they need to be empowered to empower others as well. I think that's really one of the best ways to do it, if not the best, right? But so you definitely want to have a fallback. You definitely need to have, peer review, knowledge sharing sessions, and good documentation. So this is nothing new, but this one is very much important and not to be neglected. Okay, next. God object. So how many times have you said to yourself, all right, there are some main objects that that are characteristic to every cloud that Salesforce has. So for instance, in Sales Cloud, there's the opportunity. Service Cloud, it's the case. For Financial Services Cloud, well, it could be the financial account. For Field Service Lightning, it is the service appointment. And so it goes and so on and so forth. For Marketing Cloud, it could be campaign. But there's one object in particular that applies to every single cloud, and that would be the account, in addition to those other key focal objects. And God forbid you decide to replicate all that functionality in the custom object, then your custom object seems to be the answer to everything. And so the God object is when you pattern is when you try to overload, let's say, the account, and it becomes the person, it becomes the company, it becomes the vendor, it becomes the client, it becomes it's, let's say, an asset or a building, an inventory, everything, right? So that's the account. And for case also seems to be huge and overloaded. So what happens? You run out of fields because there's a finite number of fields that you can use. You run out of things like record types. You run out of automations, formulas, all the things, and all of a sudden you've got all these different automations firing off of the same object, which is a horrible practice, and that's the God object. And so during various exams and peer reviews, you will be, somebody needs to be able to say, listen, that's just way too many record types, too many page layouts, too much going on there. Let's try to offload some of those responsibilities for that functionality onto other objects. And so that's the God object anti-pattern. The golden hammer. And so this is different for different teams. And the golden hammer is kind of like a solution, the same solution to everything, right? So you solve all kinds of problems, whether or not this is the best fit for the situation. So developers love using code, which is something that I already mentioned. So they love using code for everything. So, I'm leaving things like workflows, process builder in here, even though we're not using those anymore. We're using flows for pretty much everything. Workflows, process builder have gone away. However, there are plenty of orgs out there that have a lot of technical depth. And so this is what it refers to. So it's, as I mentioned before, it's not always appropriate to use Apex code, just as it may not be always appropriate to use declarative tools where you need to use the code. So you just need to know when to use it. Over-reliance on a particular feature. So that's talks about, how many flows do you want to have running on a particular same exact object, right? Performance issues, maintainability, scalability, and so on and so forth. So there are a plethora of options for every single situation that can be used. So if there's something you don't know, it's probably because you haven't tried it, right? But there are communities of people who will be happy to explain, who would be happy to give you their opinion, open your eyes to something. There's plenty of books out there which will describe, and likely you will find a better solution. So you should not be using the golden hammer, the same exact approach to every single situation, because that's going to lead to problems, and that should be quite obvious at this point. Now we've got the cargo cult programming. And so things like copy pasting the code, right? So this is, first of all, what is it, right? It's not quite understanding why certain things work and also why they don't work, right? So not understanding why something works is just as bad as not understanding why it doesn't work. So if it doesn't work and you've never built it yourself, you're just trying to understand why something works because somebody else built it and it's built, there's no documentation, then you're not exactly at fault there, right? But then you do something and it starts to work, and you're just like, okay, you need to figure out what makes it tick. Otherwise, you may be setting yourself up for failure later. And this is something where you just want to avoid. Most of these anti-patterns are implemented because supposedly they save time, and there are deadlines that people have to meet. And because of these deadlines, you just want to say, okay, you know what, I'll just do it this once and then never again. But then you end up falling into the trap of reusing, and that becomes a pattern. And so make sure you don't cut those corners and say, okay, yes, I may not hit this deadline, but at least I'm not setting ourselves up for failure later. But what's even worse is if you are the person responsible for this, but you know you're not going to be on the project much longer. And so it's like, well, it's going to be somebody else's problem. I'm just going to get it done and roll off or leave the company. It's going to stay on your conscience, right? So using these various patterns, just copy pasting the code that you find somewhere like Stack Exchange or even in Trailhead, or some people say, oh, I just use this, maybe customize this and that. And all of a sudden you get lucky and something works, then that piece of code is going to work in isolation, but you know other tests are going to probably fail, right? So that's cargo cult programming. So that's something you need to understand why something works, why it doesn't work, and that's the hallmark of a true professional. Design by committee, this should be something that's super familiar to many people. At the end of the day, especially if you're a trusted advisor or an architect, you're basically paid for your guidance and opinion, right? And so you should be able to say, you know what, I'm going to be the one to make a decision on this, or we're going to pick this particular approach because it's the best practice. And we really appreciate the opinions of others, but they are not the subject matter experts here. And in order to actually move forward and iterate, and in order to develop this project further and make headway, progress, whatever you want to call it, we just need to make a decision and move on. And so why does design by committee hurt progress? Well, first of all, why does it happen in the first place? Let's just start with that. It could be that nobody wants to take responsibility. So what they do is they invite a whole bunch of people to the meeting in hopes that, well, let's not miss anybody because everybody has a valuable opinion, and therefore the blame can be shifted on someone else. Or if there are way too many people in all these meetings, then it's impossible to track who suggested what. And if somebody's taking notes, they say, you know, yes, we went with this solution because somebody else suggested, and they're no longer here. Okay. And in other situations, there's just way too many opinions. So nobody decides to take responsibility and nothing gets done. So all of those things are extremely bad. Which is why I'm including this picture here. It's basically your common adage of having way too many cooks in the kitchen, you will never get your dinner. And so again, too many opinions, lack of ownership, compromised design. Everybody seems to think that they know best, or they may also say, I don't know best, but this is my opinion. It should work like this because it's based on feelings rather than on particular facts and proven paradigms. And therefore, design by committee is a recipe for failure each and every time. There are specific committees when it comes to governance. That's different. They're supposed to provide high-level guidance. When it comes to process, and they're really important when it comes to business requirements. But when it comes to design and execution, you are there for a reason as a Salesforce professional. So therefore, do not be a yes person. Do not agree to everything blindly just to please them, because at the end of the day, you cannot please everybody. Just remember that you cannot please everybody. And design committee by committee is a practice that's to be avoided at all costs. Okay, now we've got this stovepipe anti-pattern. This is a bit more complex, where we got Salesforce as well as other systems and subsystems. They have their own specific designs. They're supposed to interact with one another. However, they don't. And so they may work pretty well in isolation, but they should be really working together. But when you integrate them, they don't seem to work at all. Again, Salesforce can work perfectly well by itself, but the ERP also works very well by itself. However, you join them together to get the greatest use of the system, and they just do not work. So therefore, when you're building integrations, obviously one of the first things you need to check is system integration tests, and they should be some of the first regression tests that need to be done. Do not leave this to the end. Every single time a change is made, a regression test on system integration should be done. And of course, one also needs to consider many things, some of which would be, okay, so this is what Salesforce is meant to do, and this is what Salesforce is designed to solve a particular problem, and this is where Salesforce has limitations, therefore we're using this other system. And the same goes for the system. So it's there for a reason. We're retaining it because Salesforce is not able to take care of what this other system does, and therefore we should make sure that those two systems operate in concert. Maybe there will be a little bit of an overlap in functionality, but really not that much. Make sure that there are distinct features that Salesforce takes care of, and then other systems also take care of other, because Salesforce is not a solution for everything, right? But they do need to work together, not in isolation, not in the silo, not as a stovepipe. And now we've got this super famous big ball of mud anti-pattern. So there is a reason why certain implementations are called greenfield and certain others are brownfield. Is because you get into a Salesforce environment, sometimes you just don't know what was built and why it's there. And all of those things that we just discussed are present. And it's a huge mess just because perhaps many other people worked on the system before you. And there's a reason why they're no longer working on that project. Maybe they were fired. It could be that the client is the problem. But regardless, it's a huge ball of mud. Sometimes it's actually cheaper to step away from that org completely and end up working in a greenfield environment. So you migrate what you need to migrate and rebuild everything from scratch. So the big ball of mud is just adding on features on top of other features that don't work well. And there's no way of knowing if this is all going to work well together in the end. Again, not knowing where things are stored, why they're built a certain way, not understanding the existing design. Perhaps it's not the optimal design, or maybe it's not being used correctly, right? And so it can't scale. It's just a nightmare. So that's the big ball of mud right there. And I'm pretty sure that most people can relate to that. Intense coupling. So Salesforce has really evolved to the point where you would want to decouple various patterns and connections, or at least not completely decouple, but have loose coupling. So one such example would be to use lookup relationships rather than master detail relationships. And so what's the benefit of that is greater flexibility. If something breaks, then you're able to fix that system without affecting others, at least not as much. If, for instance, sharing recalculations are necessary, well, it's a lot easier and faster to do it when you have less master detail relationships. Sometimes you don't have a choice, right? But relying on master detail, for instance, would be way too dangerous. For processes, there is a great practice, I personally think, of using platform events on platform. You do not have the kinds of limits that you would have to be aware of when using platform events when integrating with other systems, which is what they're meant to be used for primarily. But platform events can be used essentially in an unlimited fashion on platform, and it can be done to decouple certain declarative automations. So if you instead couple everything has to be real time, everything is dependent on everything else, well, then you really have to keep track of all the dependencies, and it just becomes much more complex over time. And then the tests become more convoluted, and it just is extremely difficult to maintain that system. So loose coupling is something that is extremely important to introduce, and loose coupling is really going to prove to be a much more flexible approach in the future. Now, this happens. This typically happens in larger environments, large companies, governments, situations where there is seemingly large or even unlimited budget, if that even exists. So different people, different groups come over and say, oh, you know what, we're way too different. Our business units are different, our business processes are different. We have different requirements for the way we work. There's also, let's say, reportability requirements different, and then what's the one that I'm thinking of? Compliance requirements are also extremely different, and we absolutely cannot share our data with anybody else. So some of those are solid arguments for using multiple orgs, but they're way harder to maintain, way more expensive with a lot more risks. Now, if these are completely different and they operate in silos for good reasons, then that's a perfect use case. However, if they have to be integrated with one another, then that becomes a serious issue, because it's a lot more costly to do that, and a higher level of understanding and professionalism and knowledge needs to be employed here to run a multi-org environment rather than a single org environment. But also with that comes a lot more flexibility. Then you basically have greater system limits, right? So ungoverned org proliferation is bad. Governed org proliferation is good. So sometimes you just cannot avoid org proliferation. That's understandable as long as there's good reason, right? But there better be some consistency, and efficiency must be at one of the cornerstones. Security cannot be jeopardized. So what I'm doing here is I'm including a cheat sheet, which is going to give you the pros and cons for both single org, multi-org environments. There could be many more, but this is a very, very good rule of thumb of when to consider multi-org, whereas where I could consider single org architecture and approaches. Spaghetti sharing model. It also goes hand in hand with what we just covered in intense coupling. So spaghetti sharing model, and also spaghetti models can also apply to integrations. But in this case, we're just dealing with the platform. So this is something to which I alluded, using too many master detail relationships. Well, in this case, what we're doing is using tons and tons of sharing rules without a clear strategy. So security is one of the key aspects of Salesforce. In fact, any exam that you take, security is usually the area which gets scored most stringently, and it makes up the great percentage of that test. So security is like the most important thing for Salesforce. So because of that, a lot of people decide to say, okay, you know what, we got to make sure that everything is super secure. We're just going to use sharing rules for everything. What about org-wide defaults? What about using specific permission sets? Even profiles are important to be able to give object level security. Well, again, sharing rules are for data, not necessarily just access to certain objects. So everything does start with the org-wide defaults. Then there can be Apex sharing, manual sharing. There's many, many options. There's many different ways information can be accessed, or access can also be denied. So the spaghetti sharing model here is also to be avoided at all costs. This is probably the scariest thing because let's say you're trying to unbundle this and all of a sudden folks get access to the information that they shouldn't have access to. And at that point, you are you're basically doing quite the opposite of what you are there to do. So you're creating greater risk. And that could cause a lot of liability for you and the company you're working with. So if, for instance, you inherit this type of a situation, this absolutely has to be done in sandbox. Most likely it's going to end up being in a full sandbox environment. And with select group of users, it could be very expensive to fix, and it is absolutely a nightmare. So spaghetti sharing models also to be avoided at all costs. Not only that, but remember, there are limitations. You can only use 50 sharing rules that are criteria based, and then overall 300, of which Apex sharing is definitely a huge part, most of which is 250 would be Apex. And that is to be used sparingly because some people run out of available sharing rules, so they end up requesting more from Salesforce. And if Salesforce ends up giving it to you, then eventually you're going to run out of that too. And at that point, you're stuck. So you're out of sharing rules, and what do? Right? So this has to be very carefully considered. So a good solution architect, good technical architect would be able to advise you on how to best structure a sharing model in Salesforce. All right. Now we're getting into a bit more fundamental stuff. So remember that Salesforce is not a relational database. A Salesforce data model is, I would say, pretty unique. So it is proprietary. It's called DBMS, designed by Salesforce. And those folks who say, Salesforce, I can figure it out quickly because it's just like a relational database that I'm used to. And I'm a database expert because I love SQL servers, Postgres, and so on. So SQL cannot be that different from SQL or MySQL. Well, guess what? There is particularities. There are certain unique factors that make Salesforce what it is, right? So be careful working with folks who quickly assume that Salesforce is going to be easy to adopt, just because they know that there is a relational database and how these relational databases work. So I see that a lot of folks coming from, say, Oracle and say, well, Salesforce is built on top of Oracle. How hard can it be? Well, that's where a lot of problems arise. And Salesforce database also cannot be accessed directly, right? So all the other safeguards are in place for a reason. So as not to corrupt the Salesforce underlying database. So that's basically, you got to keep that in mind. Okay, so at this point, there's really quite a bit that we have yet to cover. So we'll talk about the unique differentiators, data management, the consequences, excessive use of code, not using roles profiles, ignoring training, governance, user experience, and so on, skipping the updates, best practices, how to avoid all of this. And this is basically what I have left for the next part 2. But most importantly, I would love to get the insight and the input of my usual audience and discuss every single one of these anti-patterns and perhaps maybe others that you may have encountered. So that will help me expand this presentation and make it better, make it more comprehensive. So at this point, I'm going to say goodbye and hope to see you all in a week. And at that point, we will continue. All right, thank you very much.